Good evening, everyone. It is 8:07 in this edition of Wave Extra. Happy to be back. I'm Jose Sosayeb here manning the desk once again, coming back from a little break. Appreciate you joining us on the Wave Now app on your smart TV, of course. If you're among our viewers checking in from our social media channels on Facebook, X, YouTube, and Twitch, appreciate you checking in as we're delving into the big stories of the day. And of course, there'll be time for much more analysis, breakdown, updates on the reporting if you make sure to join us tonight on Wave News at 11. But let's get right into it. And we're going to begin with perhaps the big announcement locally within Louisville and Jefferson County. And we're talking a nearly $500 million investment. This is one of Louisville's biggest companies. Perhaps some of you tuning in tonight work for GE Appliances. Well, leadership announcing a major expansion and investment. So yeah, $490 million at the Louisville Global headquarters. And the goal is to really dedicate these resources to building washing machines, as the phrase is, to reshore some of these specific jobs. In fact, the move bringing 800 new full-time jobs to Louisville. And we're going to give you this bird's eye view of where this is all going to play out. So we'll make sure to play the video there. You might be familiar with this particular campus at the Appliance Park. The announcement coming in shortly before noon today. 800 jobs coming into Louisville. They were previously jobs for workers in China. So again, the concept of reshoring playing out here once those jobs are filled and hired by folks. GE moving its washing machine manufacturing, of course, from China here to Jefferson County. Company leaders calling it a move based on a strategy of manufacturing appliances as close as possible to the customers who are buying them. That is per GE Appliances leadership there. Governor Andy Beshear, in today's big announcement, quick to react, saying the move actually secures Louisville as GE Appliances global headquarters. And we also heard from CEO Kevin Nolan talking about what this means for the future.
Right now, many companies are struggling to make big decisions like this. And what we're announcing today, it's a bold one, and one that it will shape our future, the future in the state, and the future in our city.
Now, GE says this investment is going to grow the total area of what it calls its clothing care production to the size of 33 football fields. So picture that, and we're going to have a map to show you just the scale if you're not familiar. Now, this place is already so big. By the way, it has its own zip code. Again, if you are an employee or someone involved with the company, that may not be a surprise to you. But it does have a big impact on the state economy, generating $655 million in state and local taxes, contributing $12.8 billion to Kentucky's GDP. So that is the scale that we're discussing when it comes to the investment. GE says it's actually going to be redesigning one of its buildings to handle the assembly of 15 models of front-load washers. And we're told it'll showcase the latest that they hope to roll out in automation and robotics. Now onto the map, just to give you a scale of the size for the GE Appliance Park. There you can take a closer look. Even has the visitor center, Studio U. You're circling here where that's going to be. The zip code, of course, mentioning there on Butcher Bank Road. And so picture what will be coming into this plot of land for this massive new development for laundry equipment for the clothes washers. We're told, in fact, it's for two different kinds of production. It's a combo washer dryer and a front load washer. That is what GE says will be the investment brought in from this nearly $500 million plan to further invest those resources here in Louisville. Okay. It is 8:11 tonight. Wanted to take you outside for a bit thanks to our SkyTrack network. Let's take a quick look here. And yeah, that was a surprise. Look at that crowd. Now, perhaps we're used to thinking we're going to be talking about Bats games, exciting as the Major League season wears on along with AAA baseball. But no, this is a sellout crowd, one of 3 sold-out crowds, or at least that's what the website says, for the Party Animals. This is the 2025 Banana Ball World Tour view. Take a look at that. Now, if you're familiar at all with the Savannah Bananas and the kind of, fun production they bring to baseball, well, the Party Animals are a partner with them. A rival club, of course, they play each other, but they're still partners in bringing this kind of entertainment along. So maybe you're joining us from out in the field, or maybe you're on your way there, or as may also be the case, you might have tickets for tomorrow night heading into the weekend. Hopefully you have a lot of fun. There's even a lottery to try and get in on these tickets as fast as you could. So the party animals, we know they're playing the Visitors. So if this brings back the days of the Harlem Globetrotters and the Generals, then, that's pretty familiar territory, you might say. And thankfully, not much in the way of dangerous weather or inclement weather to ruin the party for the animals and the crowd there at Slugger Field. So great to see that tonight. Okay, coming up next on this after the break here on Wave Extra, we are going to hear our breakdowns from the testimony down in Bowling Green for this trial involving Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson regarding Crystal Rogers' disappearance. We're going to hear from not just our reporter down there in the courthouse, Alina Noakes, but also more insight and analysis from our legal expert, our analyst, Leland Hulbert. So stick around. I'll be right back with much more Wave Extra. Good evening, folks. On this Thursday, I'm Jose Sosaya with this edition of Wave Extra, bringing you the latest updates from the trial down in Bowling Green regarding Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson pertaining to Crystal Rogers' disappearance. That trial, of course, dominating much of our coverage and, of course, your interest, sending our team down there to cover what's going on in Bowling Green in the Warren County Courthouse. For those updates for tonight's edition, we're going to check in with our reporter there getting that vital, very dramatic testimony from inside. That's our Alina Noakes. And I'm going to tee up Alina really quick here. Welcome Alina in. And Alina, as we go into tonight, heading into tomorrow morning, I know depending on each witness's testimony, they each might add a different puzzle piece to the story both sides are going to want to build. I did want to start with one name who's a character who was actually brought up early on by prosecutors because he, according to them, plays a pretty critical role in, I guess, the first chapter of what they're calling the conspiracy. So if you want to touch on what he had to say, since he was toward the end of the day, talk about this particular witness.
Yeah, that witness, obviously, Danny Singleton. In fact, he's not a name that we don't know of. We knew about him prior in 2016. He was actually pled to charges regarding perjury on the stand during his grand jury about this very case. So we do know his name already from that point in time, and the fact that he also knew Brooks Houck. That obviously coming up today because during opening statements, the prosecution said that he was told by Rosemary Houck that she was looking for someone to get rid of Crystal Rogers. And if you recall, to yesterday during our story, our breakdown of it, we said that he said, quote, "If you got enough money, you can get anything done." So he testified to that today on the stand. So it's not just something that the jury considered in opening statements. In fact, they're not supposed to consider opening statements as evidence. So him testifying to it today solidifies that as a witness, saying that she did indeed say that to him. He says he had no other communication with Rosemary past that point or Brooks Houck. But I do want to point out the defense obviously coming up on that in the cross, and they were saying basically trying to discredit him as a witness, because when he was first talked to in 2015, he denied having any conversation like this, or having any conversation with Rosemary or any of the Houck family, or knowing anything about Crystal Rogers and where she might have gone to. So they tried to discredit him there, as well as multiple other times when KSP and the FBI and multiple other law enforcement agencies tried to talk to him for information. It wasn't until the IRS talked to him and basically was like, "Do you want a deal?" that he decided to say this and then plead down on his perjury count. So that obviously is something the defense is trying to say here in discrediting a witness. It's not the first witness they've done this to. It's just going to be interesting to see if the jury takes it into account when they're considering his testimony, Jose.
Now, Alina, you mentioned sort of the strategy attorneys are going to take as far as, poking holes, discrediting witnesses' testimony when it pertains to when it might, jeopardize their particular interest for their client or for the Commonwealth in this case. You mentioned Danny Singleton's role, and so that's how the defense is going to attack him. But we also saw how prosecutors brought their own counter for discrediting Brooks Houck's alibis, you might argue, in the timeline that he set up. There was one witness in particular, and you and I were discussing this, that you touched on particularly, even though I know you were getting busy popping in and out of the courtroom. But he was someone who seemed to, physically have, geographically a close relationship with Brooks Houck and Crystal Rogers. And he had some pretty interesting testimony to say. What did you find out from him?
Yeah, that was Richie Riggs. He actually lived next door for about 6 months before Crystal Rogers disappeared to Houck and Rogers in the house that they lived in there on, I think it's Glenview Drive. So he has a geographically close relationship with two of them, and was known to go over to their house at times to work out contracts, because he worked directly with Brooks Houck on realty and construction. So very close relationship there, and the prosecution used him to kind of testify to how well he knew Brooks and his personality, as well as Crystal and her personality, and then of course to their relationship. But the one note here is that he was out of town the weekend that Crystal disappeared, and he learned about her disappearance whenever he got back into town on the 5th, which is the Sunday, obviously the same day they found her car on the side of the Bluegrass Parkway. And he testified that a woman approached him, her name's Brooke, and told him that she was gone. And he asked, "What about the kids?" And when she told him that the kids weren't with Crystal, that they had been left behind, he said, "That's just not right. She's a good mother. She wouldn't do that." Obviously, we've heard that from Sherry Ballard and Crystal's family. He called her a really good mother and said that she would have taken them with him. So it was kind of a red flag for him. And then testifying to Brooks Houck and his personality, the big theme today for the prosecution was when they're talking about a timeline, and the timeline that Brooks set for himself as in his written statement to police, but then also what he left out about July 3rd in the evening, kind of not being detailed about how Crystal and his night went there at the Houck family farm. He was asked if Brooks Houck is forgetful and does he have a good memory, and he said he does have a good memory. He's not a forgetful person. He's worked with him for a long time. And then he was asked about Crystal specifically, and this is kind of where we get into, was there a rift in their relationship? The prosecution detectives were interested in that. The defense alleging that, he loved her. They showed text messages today to that effect around the time she disappeared. And he was asked, was Crystal worried that Brooks Houck might move her out? He said yes. And did she tell him that she was preparing to leave? And he said yes. So it's kind of the first time we've really heard that she was as dissatisfied as we've heard prior when it comes to their relationship being a little bit on the rocks at times.
Certainly so much to have to parse, and the jury has the leeway there, Alina, to try and ask questions if there's certain tidbits of testimony that they're trying to get a clear answer, and presumably they're going to hear from so many more different people. So you mentioned to me earlier today they took the opportunity to ask their own questions. Was there anything interesting that you noticed about what they asked and why they would have asked it? What did you witness there?
Yeah, so they asked a couple of questions, just two, and this is the first time that they've asked in the 3 days that we have been going on in trial. I guess technically two, because yesterday was witness testimony, opening statements. But the two that they asked were their messages left when Brooks Houck called 3 different times to Crystal Rogers. Obviously, in the prosecution bringing up the idea that he wasn't really helping in the investigation, wasn't really actively trying to find her. The defense brought up the fact that he had texted her and he had called her a couple of times. So they asked, did he leave her any messages? And this is Detective John Snow answering. He says they didn't have that information when they got the call logs, but based on the duration that they could see, it's unlikely that he did. And the second question, were the clothes she wore to Walmart on July 3rd found in the house? And he said no. The one thing we did get presented today was some surveillance video from Walmart on July 3rd, earlier in the afternoon, before they went to the Houck family farm, her and Eli, allegedly, and Brooks Houck. So they asked, did she wear the same, did they find the clothes that she was wearing that day? And he says that to their knowledge, in that house, they did not find those clothes. Jose.
All right, excellent. Thank you for that breakdown. Our Alina Noakes, of course, reporting all the updates in and outside of the courtroom for us as this trial plays out, looking at testimony pertaining to Brooks Houck's and Joseph Lawson's alleged involvement in Crystal Rogers disappearing. We appreciate Alina's insight, getting all those notes and connecting all of the dots. So, Alina, we're going to let you go for the night. We appreciate you very much. Thank you, Alina.
Thanks, Jose.
All right, we're going to take a quick commercial break and be right back here on Wave Extra. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this segment of Wave Extra. Once again, joined by our legal analyst, Leland Hulbert, as we're following the testimony we're seeing play out in Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson's trial down in Bowling Green. Always appreciate Leland making time to come check in with us.
Sure.
So talk to me, you could call it the main character, but just the testimony we're hearing today again from Detective Snow. And we heard a lot of different tidbits from both prosecution and defense, and just scanning through our notes, was there anything, I'll start with how the prosecutors were approaching the case they were trying to build and having Detective Snow up there. Was there something I don't want to presume that you're hoping to listen to anything, but were there things you were hoping or thinking that they might touch on to help further flesh out the case?
I think you can start to see what roadmap each side is taking by, examining and cross-examining the main witness, which is the lead detective. Now, he may not end up being the main witness, but he's certainly one of the most important ones. And you can see the prosecution is trying to show inconsistencies, and the more they show that Houck is a liar, the less the strength the defense has, because they're building their case around his actions. The defense, on the other hand, is starting to poke holes and say, well, wait, didn't you just focus only on Brooks Houck? The cell phone data doesn't quite match up. There's other issues with the Houck family and these phone calls and Stephen Lawson's involvement. So the defense knows the weak spots, and they're going to try to drive a truck through it. And the prosecution knows the strong points, and they're going to try to buoy them. So they're both just posturing, but I think it gives you a pretty good idea of where they're headed. Because once trial starts, then you learn the theme. And, things can change, and witnesses can change things. But overall, you're looking at where are they headed and how are they going to prove that.
If I remember correctly, you maybe you weren't having that conversation with me leading up to, perhaps you're having it with Alina, and I know you sat down with her, but you had touched on it would behoove the defense not to overplay their hand in poker about the fact they never produced Crystal's body. And it seems, based on what you're hinting at, is that they're going at it about discussing other names and perhaps you mentioned the pattern in behavior. So perhaps that would be the prudent strategy that you were talking about earlier and saying, like, don't just zero in on no physical evidence, try go about it this route.
I think the defense is trying to say there's probably 4 or 5 alternate theories, because I know they mentioned that Crystal was prone to running away when they had a fight, or other family members were also driving things, or other people had involvement. They'd argued in the past. So there's 4 or 5 off-ramps that the defense is trying to build, so the jury will be like, well, maybe this happened, maybe that happened, or maybe they don't. There's so many off-ramps, they can't tell which way is straight. And what that means is reasonable doubt. So it's not so much that the defense has to prove 100% their theory. They just have to show there's alternate theories that make sense. And if those theories make sense, each theory that has credibility takes away from the prosecution's main theory, because the prosecution's really only presenting one avenue of what happened. And they have some variance, because you can't tell exactly nobody knows exactly what happened. Right. But I think they're just prosecution's trying to strengthen the relationship that Crystal had with these people, especially Brooks Houck. And the defense isn't necessarily trying to distance themselves, but they're trying to show some deficiencies in Crystal, some inconsistencies. So how can you prove a case with all of these things that are happening on a regular basis that were odd?
The contradictions, you might say.
Right.
I was looking at the notes for the prosecution. There's a note about when Detective Snow was, I think, present when Nick Houck made the phone call, and he picked up the phone. And Snow, I think his testimony was saying that until Nick Houck called, he did not suspect him of being involved. I just don't know if the mere mention for the prosecution or the involving that sort of moment in the narrative and the story, what that says to you, perhaps, for either where the prosecution's going on this part.
Yeah, it sounds like I couldn't tell if Nick Houck, if the call happened while they were interviewing Brooks Houck and they asked Nick to call, or Nick called in. I think Nick called Brooks and said, stop talking.
Exactly.
And Brooks said, no, I'm going to keep talking. So the defense can say, look, he's telling you the truth because he wanted to keep going. And the prosecution's trying to show that the family was corrupt. And, that this rogue police officer is a Houck and trying to scully the investigation, or at least poison it to the point where he's talking to witnesses. Now, if I had a brother or a relative who was a police officer, I'd want to know what they think about me talking to the police. But it seems like Nick was pretty adamant to stop talking, and that's more of a lawyer's role. So it's a little bit fishy. But also something that's routinely done if you have law enforcement Law enforcement always wants the people to talk
Yes.
unless it's their relative or unless they're in the bear trap.
And it's not like you in a particular situation, you would advise your clients of the same thing. It's just the perception involved of, you know,
Right.
when someone's so, A, their job, but B, also their relationship to the person would determine that perception.
I routinely tell people, you know, you don't want to talk to the police without a lawyer present. That doesn't mean you shouldn't talk to the police, and doesn't mean you shouldn't be cooperative if you have a good defense or you're not involved. But, you know, the police have the advantage when it's fresh. And that's the problem with this case, is it was never fresh. I mean, they had some early on interviews, but it's been going on for 10 years, and there's layers of evidence, and there's no way you could expect them to all be consistent. And in this case, they're especially inconsistent.
And what do you make of the mention that it seems the information becoming public that when Nick Houck made the phone call, even if, you know, Detective Snow within their capacity, they didn't release that knowledge, but somehow, you know, with Bardstown PD processing the cruiser, that somehow makes it out into the local paper. I don't know if you're thinking what they're also trying to stress is from then on, it was going to be impossible to get an untainted, unobstructed version of any kind of truth, because at this point, people were just learning a little too much before everyone could dot their I's, cross their T's.
Right, and that's one of the defenses, is they got tunnel vision. Once they set their sights on Brooks Houck, they stopped looking at other people, and I don't think that's true. But it's a fair argument to make by the defense, because their client, Brooks Houck, is on trial. And a lot of people think that he may have done it. And so the defense is going to try to say that anyone could have done it. It's a disappearance case. There's not a lot of evidence, so you should be looking at 100 people, not one person. But, you know, the law enforcement's going to argue that a lot of times a significant other is involved in a missing person or a murder. Especially what we see on TV these days with Dateline and everything else. Yeah. It's almost always the spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend. So, you know, it cuts both ways. Sure. And the jury is not going to make their final decision just because they were in a relationship. It's going to be based more on evidence.
Does a juror think about, and perhaps this will play out as we hear more from the defense, in that, do you think, is it enough to just talk about perhaps this history with those text messages between a couple and say, fine, you know, we established a pattern where they might have these communications, but it wasn't anything out of the ordinary, you know, and at least the way they're describing it is the one who would sort of extend the olive branch in this situation is Houck, that it wasn't Crystal asking him to, you know, come back after some sort of tiff. It was,
Right.
She would, you know, want to separate herself from the situation, and he's the one saying like, well, no, I want to make up. You know, kind of make it seem like he's the one who was invested in the relationship at all.
It depends how they want to spin it, because they can certainly make an argument that Houck was trying to play peacemaker, but there's also the fact that they had a lot of arguments, and he has other children with other women. And so, you know, if they're going to try to play Brooks Houck is the angel and is the guy that's going to unify everything, and he was just looking out for Crystal, they better make sure there's nothing bad about him. Because once you start putting in character evidence or mentioning a relationship where he's the good guy, all of a sudden if there's anything where he's lying or anything that points to him being the bad guy, which some of the things he said in his statement were peculiar. I think he had a recorder in his pocket. I mean, in this day and age, everybody has a recording device. It's called a cell phone. So that's not extreme, but it's rare. You don't often see people recording their own interview.
Did it strike you as odd, and maybe you had known this beforehand, but for someone to pop into an interview situation, and you might be the officer or the detective and saying this is going to feel more or less organic, like no one, or maybe not no one, but oftentimes who's coming in prepared with a detailed, either a list of bullet points or in Houck's case, a written statement that he was reading off of?
I think, in my opinion, that's so rare, it does raise some red flags. I mean, normally bringing a lawyer with you is done all the time. I don't think anyone would question that. I think the police are always a little frustrated because they want to get their first crack at someone without a lawyer. But if a lawyer's present, that's fairly normal. Having a printed statement that you're reading to police that you didn't say you and your lawyer prepared together, that you prepared, is odd, because typically that would tell me that you probably prepared it with other people. And if you have nothing to hide, why prepare a statement? And, you know, the truth usually is somewhere in the middle. It doesn't necessarily mean he committed a murder, but it's an odd, I don't think I've ever seen someone read a statement in a police booth.
And another note, and not to say that, you know, for you with your experience, it just would be something else you would make a little bullet point of, is him. I believe there was a point in the testimony where, you know, he was reading his copy. I believe Detective Snow mentioned, let me take a look at that. And there were markings that Houck had put on it, to like the squiggles or the X's, to say, like, I don't want anyone editing or, you know, altering this particular statement that I'd made. So it's like, and he asking for a copy of himself. So he seems like it's too precious to him for it to have anyone else take it over.
If I was the prosecution, I would probably try to say that that's a control freak tactic. And if he's a control freak, he's also wanted to control Crystal and then did whatever he did. I mean, because it is an odd behavior, and it's someone who thinks that they are, I don't want to say outsmarting the police, but your statement is your statement, and you can say whatever you want, and you're believed based on your reactions and how you answer questions. And bringing in that statement, I don't think is a great idea. But at the end of the day, he can argue. If he testifies, he can explain it. If he doesn't testify, then the prosecution can sort of make assumptions about why he did what he did.
I wanted to ask you too, if in the defense's case, you know, they can also add this element for the jury to consider. And I know you've seen how we've done our sort of documentary pieces from interviews and establishing kind of if there was a rift before with Crystal's parents and how, or it just fractured completely at some point. Maybe it was trouble to begin with at that point. But them mentioning then the times that Houck had reached out to Crystal's cousin, I believe her name is Barbara, but she worked for Bardstown. So again, there's kind of that Bardstown PD connection. But you know, if you're the defense, to say maybe he didn't have the greatest relationship with her parents, but at least he made the effort to reach out to her extended family to say, can you help, or what have you found out?
Yeah,
you
I think one of the things the prosecution pointed out today was how few calls he made right afterwards. And
I believe that's a note
you
here
know,
I have
calls
somewhere.
and texts.
Yeah.
And so if you're gonna say that this person is concerned that his girlfriend or mother of his child is missing, you know, I think it's fair to presume that most people would react crazily and make 100 calls and go ask anyone, where is she, and go look for her, like, you know, do the best you can because you were the last one to see her. And this defense of she'd like to disappear, well, that's possible. But I think it doesn't mean he did anything. But I do think the prosecution will hit that in their closing, that why didn't he do more? I mean, he's trying to play himself out as the man who loved this woman, and he was the guy who tried to mend fences and things like that. Well, why wasn't he the first one looking for her? Why wasn't he searching for 5 weeks straight? You know, and so, you know, but there's other that in and of itself doesn't mean he did anything wrong, but it is kind of peculiar.
No real surprise in that for Joseph Lawson's attorney. This really had nothing to do with him in particular, although there was a mention that, you know, up until that point in the investigation, his name had never come up. Do you think, I don't know, if does it hinge on a particular witness, and I don't know who that would be, coming up to take the stand to say, okay, finally we'll hear more from the Lawson defense on where their strategy is coming into play?
I think clearly Brooks Houck is the main target. So if I'm Joseph Lawson's attorney, I'm hiding under the table, not saying anything, playing it cool, playing it low, and then when I get a chance, I'm pointing the finger at Brooks Houck, basically by saying, look, I didn't have anything to do with this, or, I mean, I knew the guy, but that was it. You minimize, because it's clear that Brooks is the main target. And that's his best defense. Now, did Joseph make jail calls like his brother or father did, or I'm sure there's other evidence going to be presented, but they probably wanted to hit big and hit first with your lead detective through your main actor. You know, if Brooks Houck is the main target here, they want to start with that. I'm sure they'll get to Joseph Lawson in the coming days.
Okay. When you've done this much, you know, questions and wanting testimony from the detective on the stand, does past experience, and I know, in a trial, you can never repeat the unique circumstances, but does it suggest to you that we're going to hear from any more kind of law enforcement witnesses or voices at this stage?
Usually you would. I mean, because the lead detective usually comes in hours later, days later. You have people that do minor things like collect evidence, who interview different witnesses, who collect evidence. What did you see at this scene? How was the car looking at this? I mean, the detective can't do it all himself. And especially something that spanned 10 years, and then I think even the FBI took over part of this after the detective retired. So I would certainly expect more law enforcement officers, but he's probably the main one.
Okay. All right. All right, that's going to do it for this segment of Wave Extra. Always appreciate our analyst, Leland Holbert, making time for us. And again, this is a Thursday. Presuming, who the voice on the witness stand will be heading into tomorrow, as we'll watch that scene play out from the courtroom in Bowling Green. Again, for all those updates, you can always catch them online on the app. We'll dissect those with Leland as we get those with the testimony playing out in real time. Leland, always good to have you in studio.
All right, thank you.
We'll take a quick break and be right back. All right, everyone, welcome back. Coming up on 8:45, and here is a view of a much emptier Louisville Slugger Field, presuming that the Party Animals just wrapped up their first of a series of weekend games here in Louisville. I was trying to refresh to see what the final score was, but here you take a look at our downtown SkyTrack camera. Looking like it was a pretty nice out for the crowds as they're making their way back to their cars and heading home from this night of fun baseball. So a reminder here for us at the Wave Extra desk, you can always get your updates on the free Wave News app to download on your smartphone or your Android device. Here we are on the Wave Now app for your smart TV, connecting on all the different social media channels. And as we're heading into later in the night, make sure you join us on Wave News at 11. Our Logan Perrone with his latest investigations, breaking down more of the key bits of testimony from today's discussions and conversations and everything that was said on the witness stand pertaining to the Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson trial in Bowling Green. And of course, breakdown of today's weather looking ahead to the rest of the weekend with Chief Meteorologist Kevin Harned. So we hope to have you join us for that on Wave News at 11. Until then, we will see you tomorrow evening. Take care.